A woman in thrift store clothes walked into an exclusive country club. The members expected a charity case. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It shattered every assumption they'd made about worth, wealth, and what truly matters. Sometimes the most valuable things in life come wrapped in the simplest packages. And one afternoon can teach a lesson that money could never buy. The afternoon sun filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting geometric shadows across the polished marble floor of the Riverside Country Club. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls above leather armchairs and mahogany tables, where generations of wealth had gathered to separate themselves from the world beyond their gates. The air smelled of old money and fresh lilies, of privilege so deeply rooted it had become invisible to those who breathed it daily. Eleanor Chen moved quietly through the main lounge, her canvas sneakers making barely a whisper against the imported Italian tile. She wore a simple cotton cardigan, the color of faded denim, loose-fitting khaki pants, with a small patch on one knee, and a white blouse that had seen better days but was pressed and clean. Her silver hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her only jewelry was a plain watch with a leather band worn soft from years of use. She dressed this way deliberately. Not as a statement, but as a test. A way to see how people behaved when they thought you had nothing they wanted. Around her, club members lounged in their afternoon uniforms. Tailored golf attire, designer tennis whites, cashmere sweaters draped over shoulders like flags of belonging. They sipped drinks brought by staff who materialized and vanished like ghosts, their eyes sliding past Eleanor, as if she were part of the furniture. The woman at the front desk, a stern-faced gatekeeper named Patricia, had barely concealed her distaste when Eleanor approached. "Excuse me," Patricia had said, her voice sharp with practiced dismissal. "This is a private club. Members only." "I'm here to inquire about membership," Eleanor replied softly. Patricia's eyebrows rose in an expression somewhere between amusement and disgust. Her gaze traveled deliberately from Eleanor's worn sneakers to her drugstore reading glasses, cataloging every detail that didn't belong in this temple of exclusivity. "Our membership fees are quite substantial," Patricia said slowly, as if speaking to someone who might not understand basic economics. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at the community center downtown. They have very nice facilities." "I'm sure they do," Eleanor agreed, "but I'm interested in membership here." "What are the requirements?" Patricia sighed, the kind of long-suffering exhales reserved for people who refuse to understand their place. "The initiation fee alone is $150,000. That doesn't include annual dues, minimum spending requirements, or the committee approval process." Her smile was thin and cold. "We have a very selective membership, I see," Eleanor said. "And how does one apply?" Patricia's expression hardened. She reached beneath her desk and produced a thick packet of papers, dropping it on the counter with enough force to make her point. "You fill out the application, provide 3 letters of recommendation from current members, submit to a background check, financial verification, and then appear before the membership committee. The whole process takes approximately 6 months, assuming you meet our standards." She emphasized the last 2 words like throwing down a gauntlet. Eleanor picked up the application packet, her weathered hands gentle against the expensive paper. "Thank you. I'll have this back to you by next week." Patricia's laugh was brittle. "Of course you will." Across the lounge, a group of members had noticed the exchange. They huddled together like well-dressed vultures, their whispers carrying just far enough to be heard. "Did you see her shoes?" someone murmured. "Probably here asking for a job." "Or directions," another voice added with a light laugh. "Poor thing, looks lost." The cruelest comments came from a man in his early 50s, perfectly coiffed silver hair, and a golf shirt that probably cost more than Eleanor's entire outfit. "That's exactly the kind of person who's ruining neighborhoods these days," he announced to his companions, not bothering to lower his voice. "They see one nice area, and suddenly they think they belong everywhere." His name was Richard Thornton, president of the membership committee, and a man who measured his worth in country club memberships, luxury car brands, and the ability to exclude others. "This club has maintained certain standards for 75 years, he continued, warming to his subject. "Standards that matter. Quality over quantity. Exclusivity isn't discrimination, it's preservation of excellence." His audience nodded in agreement, their drinks catching the afternoon light like liquid amber. Eleanor heard every word. She'd heard versions of them her entire life, spoken in different rooms by people wearing different clothes but sharing the same fundamental belief that some people simply mattered more than others. She didn't respond, didn't argue or defend herself, just tucked the application under her arm and walked toward the exit, her humble clothes somehow maintaining more dignity than all the designer labels in the room combined. Before she reached the door, an older man intercepted her. He was perhaps 70, with kind eyes and a rumpled linen shirt that suggested he cared less about appearances than his fellow members. "James Mitchell," he said, extending his hand. "I couldn't help but overhear. Please don't let them discourage you. The club could use some new perspectives." Eleanor shook his hand, surprised by the warmth in his grip. "That's kind of you to say." James lowered his voice. "I've been a member here for 40 years, and I've watched this place become something my father wouldn't recognize. He founded this club on principles of community and fellowship, not exclusion and snobbery." He glanced back at the group surrounding Richard. Most of these people inherited their memberships along with their money. They've never had to earn anything in their lives. He turned back to Eleanor. "If you do apply, and if you need a recommendation, I'd be honored to provide one." "Why?" Eleanor asked simply. "You don't know me." James smiled. "No, but I know them, and I know that anyone they want to keep out is probably exactly who should be let in." Eleanor thanked him and left, walking through the heavy oak doors into the parking lot where her 20-year-old sedan sat among the luxury vehicles like a sparrow among peacocks. She'd learned what she came to find out. Some people judged worth by appearances. Others looked deeper. The question was whether the second group had enough power to challenge the first. Inside the club, Richard watched her departure with satisfaction. "Another problem solved," he announced. "People need to understand that not everyone belongs everywhere. Some spaces should remain elevated." Patricia nodded her approval from behind her desk, already dismissing Eleanor from her mind. Another delusional applicant who'd wasted her time. Another person who needed to learn her place. Neither of them knew that Eleanor had spent the afternoon taking careful notes. Not just about the application process, but about how these people treated someone they perceived as beneath them. It would all matter soon. Very soon. 1 week later, Eleanor returned to the club carrying a manila envelope that contained her completed application. She wore the same humble clothes, the same worn canvas sneakers, the same simple cardigan. If anything, she looked even more out of place on this bright morning, a figure of plain practicality in a world built on flash and status. Patricia's expression when she saw Eleanor approach could have curdled milk. "You're back," she said, her tone making it clear this was neither a question nor a welcome. "I've completed the application," Eleanor replied, sliding the envelope across the marble counter. Patricia barely glanced at it. "As I mentioned, we require 3 letters of recommendation from current members." "I have them," Eleanor said, pulling out 3 sealed envelopes. Patricia's fingers hesitated before taking them. She examined the names on the return addresses, and her face went carefully blank. One was from James Mitchell, as expected. The other 2 were from members of such long standing and social prominence that even Patricia couldn't dismiss them outright. "How did you?" Patricia began, then stopped herself. She opened each letter, reading quickly, her expression growing more confused with each page. "These are all very complimentary," she said, sounding almost disappointed. "That's encouraging," Eleanor said mildly. Patricia set the letters aside with obvious reluctance. "Well, there's still the committee review. And the financial verification. We'll need bank statements, tax returns, proof of assets. Can't have members who can't meet their obligations." "Of course," Eleanor agreed. She produced another envelope, this one thicker. "I've included the last 3 years of financial statements, as requested in the application guidelines. The information has been verified by my accountant." Patricia took the envelope as if it might contain something dangerous. She opened it, pulled out the first page, and froze. Her eyes widened. She flipped to the second page, then the third. The color drained from her face like water from a broken glass. "This can't be right," Patricia whispered. Eleanor waited quietly. "Is something wrong?" Patricia looked up at her, then back down at the papers, then up again. These numbers, she began, her voice unsteady. Eleanor's patient silence was answer enough. From across the lounge, Richard Thornton noticed the commotion. He set down his morning coffee and strode over, confident that whatever problem had arisen he could handle it with his usual efficiency. What seems to be the issue, Patricia? She wordlessly handed him the financial statements. Richard took them with an indulgent smile, ready to dismiss whatever trivial concern had upset her. Then he began reading. The smile evaporated. His hand gripped the papers so tightly they crinkled. He read one page, then another, then went back to the first as if hoping he'd misread something fundamental. This is a mistake, he said finally. Some kind of clerical error. No error, Eleanor said simply. Richard's jaw worked silently. The numbers before him showed liquid assets in the tens of millions, investment portfolios that would take him several lifetimes to accumulate, real estate holdings across 3 states. This woman in her thrift store clothes and worn sneakers had more money than most of the club's members combined. But that's impossible, Richard sputtered. You're... He gestured vaguely at her appearance. Eleanor finished his sentence for him. Dressed simply? Yes. I find expensive clothes uncomfortable. Richard's face went through several shades of red. Other members had begun drifting closer, sensing drama. The morning's entertainment was taking an unexpected turn. If these numbers are accurate, Patricia said carefully, trying to recover some professional composure, then the financial requirements are clearly met. But there's still the committee interview. The membership vote. Standards to maintain. I understand, Eleanor said. When should I expect to hear from the committee? Richard seemed to be struggling with multiple emotions at once. Shock, embarrassment, anger at being wrong, and beneath it all the desperate need to maintain control of a situation that was rapidly escaping him. The committee meets next month, he said stiffly. You'll receive a formal invitation for your interview. Until then, this information remains confidential. Of course, Eleanor agreed. Though I should mention, I've also applied for membership at 3 other clubs in the area. One can never have too many options for recreation. She said it mildly, but the implication was clear. Word would spread regardless of what Richard wanted. In their small world of exclusive clubs and overlapping social circles, a story this good would travel faster than a grass fire. Richard managed a strangled nod. Patricia looked like she wanted to sink through the expensive marble floor. As Eleanor turned to leave, several members stopped her. They'd witnessed enough of the exchange to understand that something extraordinary had just occurred. James Mitchell approached with barely suppressed delight. I hope you'll let me know if there's anything else I can do to support your application. Thank you, Eleanor said warmly. Your kindness last week meant more than you know. After she left, the club erupted in whispered conversations. Patricia reluctantly shared what she'd seen, the numbers too shocking to keep entirely quiet despite Richard's orders. By lunchtime, half the membership knew. By dinner, speculation had turned the story into legend. One woman, they said, wore clothes from thrift stores but had wealth that dwarfed their own. Another insisted she must be some kind of financial fraud. A third suggested she was testing them, though for what purpose, no one could say. Richard spent the day trying to contain the damage, calling committee members, attempting to frame the situation in a way that preserved his authority. But the truth had a momentum of its own. That evening, alone in his study, Richard stared at a copy of Eleanor's financial statements that Patricia had discreetly provided. The numbers didn't lie. Couldn't lie. This woman had the kind of generational wealth his own family had spent a century building. And she'd walked into his club in canvas sneakers like money meant nothing at all. For the first time in years, Richard Thornton felt the uncomfortable sensation of having been completely, utterly wrong about someone. And the worst part was that everyone knew it. The membership committee interview was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon in the club's private conference room. The space was designed to intimidate, with dark wood paneling, portraits of founding members glaring down from the walls, and a long table where 7 committee members could sit in judgment while applicants faced them from a single chair positioned in the center of the room like an accused at trial. Eleanor arrived 15 minutes early, wearing the same simple clothes she'd worn to her previous visits: canvas sneakers, comfortable pants, a cardigan that had probably cost less than Patricia's manicure. The statement was no longer subtle. It was A quiet revolution. The committee members filed in, taking their seats with the gravity of judges preparing to render verdict. Richard sat at the center, flanked by wealthy executives, society matrons, and inherited fortune holders who'd never questioned their right to decide who belonged and who didn't. James Mitchell, to his credit, had used his considerable influence to secure himself a seat on the panel for this specific interview. He sat at the far end, a knowing smile playing at his lips. Richard cleared his throat and began the formal proceedings. Thank you for appearing before the committee today. As you know, membership at Riverside Country Club is a privilege, not a right. We have certain standards to uphold. Eleanor nodded. I understand. Richard consulted the papers before him, visibly uncomfortable now that he knew exactly who he was addressing. Your financial qualifications are, he paused, certainly adequate. However, membership is about more than money. It's about values, character, fit within our community. Tell us, what do you hope to gain from membership here? Eleanor considered the question carefully. I hope to find a community that values people for who they are, rather than what they own, or how they present themselves. A place where kindness matters more than clothing brands and human dignity isn't determined by price tags. The silence that followed was profound. Several committee members shifted in their seats. I also hope, Eleanor continued, to challenge myself and others to think differently about worth and belonging. Her eyes found Richard's. Because I've observed that when we judge people by appearances, we often blind ourselves to their true value. Richard's face had gone carefully neutral, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. And what exactly have you observed about our club? Eleanor's voice remained gentle, but her words carried weight. I've observed how staff members are treated as invisible, how assumptions are made about people based on their clothes or cars, how kindness is sometimes seen as weakness, and exclusion is celebrated as maintaining standards. She paused. I've also observed genuine warmth and welcome from members like James, who understand that true class has nothing to do with money. One of the society matrons, a woman named Vivian who'd been notably silent, leaned forward. These are rather harsh judgments from someone seeking to join our community. Are they judgments? Eleanor asked. Or observations? And if they're accurate, doesn't that suggest the community might benefit from different perspectives? Vivian's eyes narrowed. You walked in here wearing thrift store clothes. What were we supposed to think? That I might be a fellow human being worthy of basic respect regardless of my clothing? Eleanor's tone wasn't angry, just honestly curious. Isn't that what we teach children? That it's what's inside that matters? She had them. Every person at that table knew it. They'd built their identities around exclusion, around the belief that their wealth and status made them superior. And now a woman in a $15 cardigan was gently, inexorably exposing the hollowness at the core of that belief. Richard tried to regain control. Your point is taken. However, you must understand that certain standards exist for a reason. This club has a history, traditions. We can't simply abandon everything that's made us successful. I'm not suggesting you abandon tradition, Eleanor replied. I'm suggesting you examine whether your traditions are based on values worth preserving, or merely habits of exclusion. There's a difference between excellence and elitism. Another committee member, a tech executive named David, spoke up. With all due respect, this is a private club. We have every right to maintain whatever standards we choose. You're absolutely right, Eleanor agreed. You do have that right. Just as I have the right to observe that when standards are used primarily to exclude rather than elevate, they say more about those enforcing them than those being excluded. The room was so quiet you could hear the antique clock ticking on the mantel. Can I ask you something? Eleanor said, looking around the table. How many of you earned your memberships through your own achievements versus inheriting them? How many of you would be accepted into this club if you had to apply today, starting from nothing? The question landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading outward. Faces that had been stern and judgmental now looked uncomfortable, defensive. I built my first company from scratch, Eleanor continued quietly. Spent 20 years working 16-hour days, sleeping in my office, eating ramen because I was investing every dollar back into the business. I wore thrift store clothes then because that's all I could afford. She gestured to her simple outfit. I wear them now because somewhere along the way I learned that clothing doesn't define worth. Character does. Kindness does. How we treat people when we think they have nothing we need? That defines us. James Mitchell was openly smiling now. Other committee members looked various shades of chastened, though Richard's expression remained stony. If you have such strong feelings about our club, Richard said coldly, why do you want to join? Eleanor met his eyes steadily. Because institutions don't change from the outside. They change when people who believe in better values become part of them. And because I watched how you treated someone you thought was nobody, and I want to be here when you learn to treat everyone like they're somebody. The interview concluded shortly after. Committee members filed out in uncomfortable silence, none of the usual casual conversation or shared glances of superior judgment they'd expected to sit in judgment. Instead, they'd been gently but firmly held accountable for their own prejudices. The vote, when it came 3 days later, was 7-0 in favor. Even Richard voted yes, though James later confided that it wasn't conscience that swayed him so much as the recognition that rejecting Eleanor would make him look petty and small to everyone who now knew her story. Sometimes people do the right thing for the wrong reasons. The outcome is still progress. Eleanor's membership was officially confirmed, her initiation fee processed. The amount barely made a dent in accounts that could have funded a small nation. She began visiting the club regularly, always in her simple clothes, always kind to staff members, always willing to engage anyone in genuine conversation regardless of their status or tenure. The transformation was gradual but undeniable. New members started appearing, people who wouldn't have considered applying before. A teacher who'd won the state lotteries. A self-made entrepreneur from a working-class background. A nurse who'd inherited money from a patient grateful for her compassionate care. The club's character began shifting, old exclusions crumbling as new voices joined the conversation. Richard struggled with the changes at first. His entire identity had been wrapped up in being gatekeepered to an exclusive world. And now that world was becoming more inclusive, more diverse, more human. But slowly, imperceptibly, something in him began to soften. It started when he overheard Eleanor talking with a waiter about the young man's college applications, offering thoughtful advice with the same attention she'd give a fellow member. Richard watched her treat this minimum-wage employee with genuine respect and interest, and something uncomfortable stirred in his chest. How long had it been since he'd actually seen the people who served his drinks and cleaned his table? Weeks later, Richard found himself sitting across from Eleanor in the lounge, an encounter he'd been avoiding, but somehow knew was inevitable. I owe you an apology, he said finally, the words clearly difficult. The way I behaved when you first came here, the things I said, it was inexcusable. Eleanor listened quietly. I judged you, without knowing anything about you, Richard continued. I made assumptions based on appearances, and defended those assumptions as maintaining standards, but really I was just, he struggled with the admission, protecting my own sense of superiority. Because if anyone could belong here, what made me special? Eleanor's expression was kind but honest. You were protecting an identity built on exclusion. That's human. It's also limiting. You're right, Richard said, and I'm working on being better. It's harder than I expected, Eleanor smiled. The worthwhile things usually are. But you're doing the work, and that matters. Their conversation lasted an hour. Richard talked about his upbringing, the pressure to maintain family status, the fear of becoming irrelevant. Eleanor shared her own journey, the lean years, the moment her business finally succeeded, the conscious choice to stay grounded despite wealth that could have isolated her from ordinary human experience. When they parted, something had fundamentally shifted. Richard wasn't transformed overnight into a champion of equality, but he'd taken the first genuine step toward understanding that his worth as a person had never come from his ability to exclude others. 6 months after Eleanor joined, James Mitchell proposed her for the membership committee. The vote was unanimous. Richard himself seconded the nomination. At her first committee meeting, Eleanor suggested they revise the application process to focus less on financial status and more on character and community contribution. The suggestion was adopted with surprising ease. The club that had once measured value in dollars and designer labels began learning to measure it in kindness and character. Staff members noticed the difference first. Members who'd once looked through them now asked their names, inquired about their lives. Tips improved. Respect became the default rather than the exception. The changes rippled outward into the broader community. Other exclusive clubs in the area heard the story and began examining their own practices. Some resisted, doubling down on exclusivity. Others cautiously opened their doors wider, surprised to discover that diversity of background enriched rather than diminished their communities. One spring afternoon, Eleanor sat on the club's terrace watching the sun set over the golf course, her canvas sneakers propped on an adjacent chair, a glass of lemonade sweating gently in the warm air. James joined her, easing into a neighboring chair with a satisfied sigh. "You've caused quite a revolution," he said. "I just pointed out some contradictions," Eleanor replied. "People did the hard work of change themselves." James chuckled. "You're far too modest. You walked in here and held up a mirror, made people see things they'd been deliberately overlooking for years." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the light fade. Finally, James spoke again. "Can I ask you something? Why do you still dress like that? You've more than proven your point." Eleanor looked down at her simple cardigan, her worn, comfortable pants. "Because this is who I am. The clothes I wore when I had nothing, when I was building something from scratch, working toward a dream I wasn't sure would materialize." She smiled. "Fancy clothes wouldn't make me more myself. They'd make me less." She turned to James. "Besides, the day I start dressing to impress is the day I forget what actually matters, and what actually matters." Eleanor's gaze returned to the sunset, the sky now painted in shades of amber and rose. "That we treat each other with kindness, that we recognize worth in places we've been trained to overlook, that we build communities based on character rather than cash." She paused. "And that we remember clothes are just fabric. It's what we do while wearing them that defines us." James raised his lemonade glass in a toast. "To fabric and character." Eleanor touched her glass to his. "And to the courage to be yourself, even when the world insists you should be someone else." As darkness fell over the country club, the lights inside glowed warm and welcoming. Through the windows, members of every background mingled freely, a community slowly learning that true exclusivity lies not in keeping people out, but in creating spaces where everyone's humanity is recognized and celebrated. Eleanor's simple clothes had taught them a lesson worth far more than the membership fee she'd paid. Some things can't be bought. They can only be learned through the patient practice of seeing clearly and treating others as if their dignity matters, because it does, always has, and always will, regardless of what they wear or how much money sits in their accounts. The real wealth, Eleanor had shown them, was in choosing to be better than you were yesterday. And that was a membership fee everyone could afford. What did this story teach you about judging worth by appearances? Have you ever discovered that someone you underestimated was exactly who you needed to meet? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If stories that challenge how we measure value inspire you, consider subscribing for more tales about the extraordinary hiding in plain sight. Let us know where you're watching from today, because sometimes the most valuable lessons come wrapped in the simplest packages, and the people wearing thrift store clothes might just teach us something about wealth that money could never buy.